Hi, and welcome to my e-learning tutorial on Photoshop and how to draw caricatures in it. First, I recommend opening up a new canvas, 6000 by 6000 pixels at 600 pixels per inch. Next, create a few layers. These will serve as layers that you can draw on above the background. Next, bring in your image that you're using for reference. If you're drawing from memory, you won't need this, but I use it for dragging and dropping colors to bring along the image. Next, you're about to see me select my brush. For outlining, I use a hard brush with a hardness of 100%. I then try and find a comfortable viewing angle and use my tablet to frame the picture, as well as having a good view of my reference image before I begin to draw. Throughout the drawing, you'll see the circle that I use to draw getting bigger and smaller. I use the bracket keys located next to P and Enter on the keyboard to increase and decrease the size of the brush. In the beginning of this drawing, you can see I'm just trying to get an overall likeness of the image you can see in the top right. I'm not paying a lot of attention to these lines because I know that they will not be final, so I'm just putting pen to tablet to try and get outlines of where my final lines will be. You'll see me increase and decrease the speed of the video depending on which parts are important and which are not that important. It's in the interest of time because this whole video took me 13 hours to record, draw, and finish. Here I start to move on to the face and the facial features of the person I'm drawing. I just try and get positioning and overall likenesses for each of the different facial features to go back and clean them up later. I usually don't go back to try and make them more lifelike until I'm at the coloring in stage, but this is my first general outline. I then do a second general outline over that to ensure that all my features and different sections are in the right places. Here you see I've kind of got somewhat of a likeness of the positioning of some of the features, but I'm obviously not happy with this outline, so I go back and do it again. So I lower the opacity on that particular layer and then draw on the layer above it, just to make sure that I get a proper likeness. I also move and rescale my reference image to try and get a better see at the proportions to make sure that they're going to be fitting with my final outline. As I begin, even though as you can tell it's sped up, I'm much more careful with my strokes, as I'm more aware that some of these lines might be visible in the final drawing as they're more calculated and they're more accurate to the reference image. You'll see me continuously draw lines and then erase them. The way I do this is I have a Wacom tablet, and the pen that I use is double-sided, so I have a nib on one side that helps me draw, and on the other side I have an eraser nib, which allows me to take away from the image in the same way that the eraser tool in Photoshop does. It just saves me a shortcut. On the topic of shortcuts, I'd recommend learning all of them, obviously, but especially the ones that you use for drawing. It speeds up the process exponentially, and it makes it more enjoyable because you're not searching around menus trying to find shortcuts for flipping and rotating different objects. Instead, you just click a key binding and then it's there. I spend very little time on the outlines of the features, but I do spend a good amount of time trying to make sure they're in the right positions, because I know most of these lines won't end up in the final image. They'll be drawn over and colored over. Even different highlight sections I spend very little time on because I know they'll be colored over, but it's the positioning and the different aspects of why they're in a certain position, what direction they're facing, what shadows and what highlights are on different parts. That's what I spend my time on in this particular section. As you can see, I'm redrawing the mouth again. Now I've slowed it down particularly for this part because I use the transform tool to shape and mold the proportions of the face to make sure that they're in keeping with the reference image. I do this several times throughout the whole speed painting, but it's vital in making sure that lines you've drawn are the way that you wanted them and not in a different direction. Do a small bit of cleanup here, then I move on to putting in a small bit of her hair on the left hand side just to try and give me another frame of reference on where things are going to be, where highlights are going to be, where the eye starts and finishes. This is where I really start to draw some final lines, kind of clean up lines that are already there, but I know that this next iteration of this eye is the last outline that I'm going to do before I start colouring. So I spend a considerable amount of time, I'm zoomed in to try and get a better look at what I'm drawing. I get different opacities on different layers, I transform layers to make sure that each layer is adding to the drawing and not taking away from it. I'll redraw pupils and irises to make sure that they're in keeping with the reference image. Even if I can't see it, I can remember it from another iteration that I've drawn on how lines will go. Then add in the highlight to the eye. A lot of it's just continuation of what I've done, just redrawing lines, making sure that they fit. When I finish that, I add a bit of shadow just under the cheekbone, add a bit of shadow to the nose, and then I start on the other eye. For a lot of features and eyes in particular, I'll try and create them from parts by splitting up the layers and then bringing them back together by merging them through the layers menu. But this allows me to create them at different opacities and then merge them down so I can layer them over with highlights and shadows and different eyelashes, and this wouldn't be possible on just one layer. I also try and recreate this when I'm painting over in color, or I use those opacity layers to help shade or add shadow. Once I have the right eye cleaned up, I move on to the eyebrow. I start shading, and I add my first bit of, you could say, color. I just give it a bit of depth. Then I redraw the mouth for the third time, but I'm finally kind of happy with its proportions. I then move on to the highlights of the cheekbones. I just highlight them with an extra layer, add a bit of opacity, and then give the drawing a bit of depth by giving it a proper shadow. It's somewhat important that there's a significant likeness to your reference image if you want it to look like your reference image at this point, because without that you won't have a decent outline in order to color over that. Some people start with painting, but I can't do that. I just need a basic drawing to paint over. Once I have that done, I finish my cleanup and I decide I'm going to need some tones in order to know how dark or light parts of the image are. So I soften up my brush, I bring the hardness to 0% and I increase the size of the brush. I then go over parts on a different layer above the original layer. You'll see me zoom out from time to time and just leave the image sit there for a while. At this stage I'm just checking proportions and making sure that the image looks correct. I'll also move my reference image from the left hand side of the screen to the right hand side of the screen. This depends on which side of the face I'm working on. At this stage I'm ready to begin colouring, so I hold Alt and I click on the part of the nose I want to begin colouring on. That gives me the exact swatch of the colour that I wish to use. I do this repeatedly throughout the whole speed painting to try and get gradations and different colour blocks to make the final painting as accurate as possible to the reference picture. This particular section is slowed down to real time because I think this is one of the most important parts. I colour block each individual feature and I gradate them. I keep them separate I then zoom back several times to make sure that the proportions are still correct and in keeping with the different colors. You'll see me jump around from the left eye to the surrounding areas of skin as well as the pupil. Primary focus is getting as much color onto the painting as possible before I start to smooth it out and gradate it to make it a better representation of the reference image. As soon as I reach a different point, I go back to my reference image and I take a swatch of color. I then bring it back into the painting and overlay it. Constantly looking from my own representation to the reference image to make sure proportions, colors, features are somewhat alike. I'm going to speed up this process in the interest of time because this is the bulk of the work. All you're really going to see is me continuing to color block the whole face, and once I have that done, I'll move on to the smoothing. It's a lot of just short strokes repeated over and over again, layering colors, making sure colors that are supposed to be darker in some areas are darker than the lighter colors that are located in different areas. I pay particular attention to the lighter areas because this is a particularly light image and there are only a certain amount of areas where I emphasize the darkness. This particular clip is sped up to 10,000% just to finish out the color blocking. At times I transform by stretching and squashing the image just to see if it resembles the reference image more or less depending on which transformation I choose. Sometimes this can be effective, sometimes it's not. Sometimes I have to split the image in two and transform a certain half or warp it in a certain way to see if it fits. This can all be undone by pressing Command Z. Okay, now that we've finished the color blocking, I'm now going to move on to a section that I call color smoothing. It's a section in which I use a soft brush, preferably at a larger size than the size that I colored in with, in order to sample the different sections and features, colors, and smooth them into the lighter or darker areas. It's particularly time consuming and repetitive, so I'm going to speed it up to 4000%. All I'm doing is kind of making the rounds around the face, checking to see up against the reference image whether things fit, things are the right proportions. Not perfect, so I'm kind of refining it to make it fit. Working on the nose, selecting certain parts, elongating them or squashing them depending on what the image needs. adding highlights, just taking swatches from the original image that I'm working on and reusing them in different places depending on what the image needs. When I'm somewhat happy with the shading and toning, I check the proportions again. I sometimes select certain areas and transform them and warp them in certain directions and areas to see if it fits the image better. This is about the stage where the image starts to resemble the reference most. Previous stages are just about getting colors from one section to another, just blocking them out. Here is where you're really going for a likeness, and it's where you can be at your most creative, trying to blend, tone, shade, transform. What you may not be seeing is what I'm doing in between the sped up versions. I'm taking layers and I'm copying them and merging them down to save them in a non-destructive manner, because the layers that I'm working on, aside from undoing an extraordinary amount of times, there's no way of bringing back the pixels that you're destroying with each brushstroke, so it's good to keep a copy. For the next couple of minutes, I'll just be working on individual facial features and blending them into the environment, which is the face. Once this is finished, I'll move on to the hair. Here I've taken a selection of the eye in order to place alongside my image in order to compare and contrast what parts are different, what parts need to be worked on. I do the same here with the left eye. And again here with the mouth in order to compare and contrast from the reference image. It's just cutting out a part of it so it's easier to see alongside my painting. It's easier to take swatches and reference points from the mouth to get the same proportions and shape for my final painting image. Upon finishing the mouth and the different cheekbones, I decide that it's time to start the hair. The face isn't perfect, you'll see me come back and finish it at the very end, but I think it's as much of a likeness as I'm going to get at this point, so I begin on a different section, which is the hair, including the eyebrows. The hair is a lengthy process in which I try and get every strand to correspond to the reference image, changing colours when I need to. The hair, you could say, is more of a simple process. It's just kind of copying directions and going with the flow. It's just less gradations, less tones, just copying colors, going in certain directions, layering it on top of each other the same way hair is layered, highlights, shadows, color differences. I'm going to leave the rest of it play out until the end of the drawing from this point onwards. Sped up to about 5000%.